Cross-border policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webcast on Does Immigration Help American Employment? Before we get started, you can find the report we will be discussing today on our website at www.bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can also find there a lot of other material, including a recent explainer we have done on why children are being separated at the border. You can also find links to our podcast, This Week in Immigration, where we break down the latest news in immigration policy and politics in an easy-to-digest format. And you can subscribe to that podcast on Stitcher, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or any other medium by searching Bipartisan Policy. Just a reminder that we will be taking questions for our panelists after their presentation. You can tweet your questions via Twitter using the handle @BPC_bipartisan with the hashtag BPCLive, or you can email us your questions at bpcinfo.bipartisanpolicy.org. Feel free to submit those questions during the presentation, and we'll get to them in the second half of our webcast. Now to our speakers. Ryan Edwards is an economist and demographer who has served 2 National Academies panels, most recently one that investigated the economic and fiscal impacts of U.S. immigration. He received his PhD in economics in 2002 from the University of California, Berkeley, and was an associate professor of economics at the City University of New York prior to returning to Berkeley in 2016. He's currently a research associate at the Berkeley Population Center and a curriculum coordinator in UC Berkeley's Division of Data Sciences. Maomei Liu is lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, a visiting scholar at Brown University's Population Studies and Training Center. Dr. Liu studies causes and consequences of international migration, and much of her work focuses on migrant networks, family, gender, and legal status. Her research has been published in demography, population, space and place, and demographic research. Before Berkeley, Dr. Liu was a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University. BBC reached out to these 2 learned scholars to help with a project in which we wanted to test some theories about the impact of immigration on the employment rates of native-born American workers. The discussion of whether immigrants impact the employment of American jobs has been part of the immigration debate for several decades and is one of the arguments in favor of immigration reductions that have been proposed by members of Congress and recently endorsed by the Trump administration. But research on the actual impact of immigrants has been on American workers and their job prospects has been a bit scarce. So we wanted to see if we could contribute. So as I mentioned, we reached out to these scholars and asked that question: does immigration help or hurt American employment? And with their help and their design of a study, we found some results which they will share for you now. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan and Maomei to discuss the research, their findings, and then we'll talk about what impact it might have on the immigration debate. So Ryan, go ahead.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Teresa. So we're here on slide 1, and again, our title of our talk is Does Immigration Help American Employment? I'm Ryan Edwards. Maomei Liu is my collaborator, and it's been a pleasure to work with her. We are based at the Berkeley Population Center at the University of California at Berkeley. On to slide 2, please. Thanks very much to the BPC for supporting this research, and specifically to Teresa, to Hunter, Kenny, Cristobal, and Emily for helpful comments during this very fun time putting this vibrant piece of research together. It's been a wild ride and a really good one, too. Thanks in particular to the UC Berkeley Population Center for continuing to foster work on key demographic questions of our era, including immigration. Through that group, that was originally why I started to work on immigration back as a graduate student, and then served on the National Academies of Sciences panel that recently reopened that and looked at it. On to slide 3. This is a historical picture starting all the way back in 1850 with census data proceeding up until 2005, when our data set takes over with the American Community Survey. And the purpose of this picture is to understand why it is that immigration is at the forefront of policy. We are approaching the historic highs of the foreign-born share that we previously saw back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Following that lull in the middle of the 20th century, we've seen an increase and rising shares. We're now at 13.5% foreign-born, and again, this is the stock. It's not a measure of the flow of immigrants, but it's the total number of immigrants in our society as a share of the total population. Moving on to slide 4. This is a fantastic image that the BPC group produced for us, and it could be an image of the political landscape, but instead it's actually an image of the foreign-born share in different census divisions, collections of states. As you can see, the Pacific region at the far left leads the story with 30% foreign-born, the mountain by 14%. We're roughly sort of going from the peak into the trough there in the middle. And one of the big surprises that Maomé will talk about later was that actually a big part of the story comes out of the west north central at 6% foreign-born, and also the east north central, those regions where historically immigrants have not gone, and yet it turns out that they play a rather important role in describing what we have found in terms of the effect of immigration on U.S. Domestic employment. So that's the current picture. If we now go to slide 5 and look at a different graphic that shows the levels, those are the blue bars in these different census divisions, but also the levels in 2005, rather, the blue bars, and then the levels in 2016 are the orange bars. And so this shows us the dispersion of the changes in the immigrant share, which were tiny in the Pacific region there at the top, a very small change in the immigrant share, but very, very large changes in different regions where previously there often hadn't been a lot of immigrants. For example, in the West North Central, which is the fourth from the bottom, we see an increase from just above 5% foreign-born to something more like 7.5% foreign-born, a very large change in percentage terms if you calculated it, and a big increase that way as well. So we have seen that the geography of immigration has been changing rather substantially. And that's probably part of the reason, too, why we see the politics of immigration as we do today. It is not the traditionally high immigrant receiving regions that have seen the big increases. We have seen some increases there as well, in the Middle Atlantic, for example, the second biggest region in terms of foreign-born share, second from bottom. But we also see very large increases in the foreign-born share in areas that previously had not had large percentages foreign-born, in particular West, North, Central. Moving on to slide number 6, please. So common perspectives on U.S. immigration, one would probably not know it by reading the news this month, of course, where we are concerned with refugees and with children in particular. But a common perspective stepping back about immigrants is that they are additional workers. And so sometimes the debate starts with that and segues into places perhaps maybe it ought not. The second bullet points out that a common perspective here, which is sometimes called the lump of labor fallacy, is that new workers must have displaced old workers. So if immigrants arrive, they are workers, they must have displaced somebody, presumably a native U.S. worker. Now, the more subtle point that we don't have a ton to say about is that new immigrants might displace old immigrants. And in fact, the latest research suggests that that is probably an important channel through which we might understand the effect of immigration. But the traditional way of looking at this is natives, native workers on the one hand, immigrant workers on the other. In any event, the lump of labor perspective that you kind of have a fixed number of jobs and immigrants will take them is inconsistent with basic supply and demand theory. Supply and demand theory suggests that the demand for labor will adapt to an increase in supply and things will adjust in some way. The fine print beneath this second bullet is that we should expect firms and workers and jobs all to adapt in various ways. We know that things aren't really fixed, that firms find ways of employing workers, employees find ways of working with each other in new ways, and in fact can work together to exploit division of labor and other productive increases. Native workers and immigrant workers are often quite different, so understanding how they combine could be a big part of the story, and in particular, immigrant labor might make native labor more productive. Moving ahead to slide 7, the point is that theory is ambiguous here. Some basic theory suggests one direction of effect. The more advanced theory suggests, in fact, you might have offsetting effects, and you don't know which way one might see the net effect of immigration go. So social scientists agree unanimously that the next step would be to examine what data say about the theory, which way, in fact, does immigration push native employment. Where scientists disagree is exactly how to do this. And the problem is that we don't have obvious control and treatment groups as one might in what's called a medical trial. There we might assign a particular treatment to a randomly selected group and compare results to a control group that received a placebo. And that's this industry standard in medical trials. The problem is that when the treatment is immigration, it's usually hard to identify control and treatment groups that are identical except for immigration. So what can we do? Let's look at slide 8. We can compare small US regions that are treated by immigration to those that were not. And this is similar in spirit to the famous Mariel Boatlift study by the economist David Card, where he looked at Miami, which was treated with a very large amount of immigration out of Cuba during the Mariel Boatlift that the Castro administration had started, and compared that treatment group to other control cities that did not receive the treatment of immigrants. So our study doesn't do that exactly. It looks more broadly at many types of regions and examines the small US regions that received immigrants and compared them to those that did not. It uses a standard, modern, and proven statistical tool, which is described in greater detail in our working paper. And the way it proceeds is examining data on over 1,000 small geographic areas in small public use census data that's collected annually between 2005 and 2016. Each of these small areas is on average about 300,000 or about a third of a million people. They're larger than counties, but they are the smallest geography that the census reports, and they do not cross state lines. So it's a good way of looking at small control and treatment groups, compact areas where local labor markets are reasonable sample units. And when we looked at it, now turning it over to Maomei to discuss our results, we found something that was surprising. And over to Maomei now.
Thank you, Ryan. So when we examined trends in employment rates of native U.S. workers alongside trends in foreign-born shares of the local labor force between 2005 and 2016, the surprising result that we found was that employment rates for native workers actually increased. They actually rose by a small but significant amount when more immigrants actually arrived. And we find that this result is actually noteworthy because it contrasts the kind of dire predictions from that lump of labor fallacy that we referred to earlier, in which immigrant workers simply displace natives. Next slide, please. So as Ryan mentioned, there's a really interesting kind of geography in general about the kind of stock of immigrants and how it's changed over just in the time period of our study between 2005 and 2016. But we also found that there was great variation in both the size and the significance of the immigrant effect across these regions. So both areas with already high shares of immigrant laborers were not the only areas that benefited from the arrival of new immigrants. Native U.S. workers in traditionally immigrant-scarce regions like the Midwest gained from immigration, as did natives in immigrant-plentiful regions like California. Neither did we find that the size of the positive employment effect was explained by a division's immigrant share, nor how fast the immigrant share was changing. So if we look at the next slide, we can see the kind of diversity of the model results across the US divisions. So these are districts defined by the US Census that was shown in the map in figure 3 in the policy paper and in a couple slides earlier. So here we found that there was large and statistically significant influence of immigration on native employment in 5 of the 9 divisions. And these are, again, a mix of areas with both low and high immigrant shares. So we found really large positive coefficients for the Mountain Division, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. For the West-South Central Division, this being Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas, as well as the East-North Central Division, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. You can see those as being the longest bars in blue. In In these three divisions, the coefficient hovered around 0.94. We also found really large positive effects of immigration on Native employment in the West-North Central Division, which is Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota, as well as the Pacific Division, Arizona, Alaska, California, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington. In the four other divisions, the estimated effect of immigration was statistically insignificant, as denoted by the white bars in this figure, but they are positively signed in 3 cases and negatively signed in the New England division. So after finding that our results were fairly robust in terms of geography, we wanted to run our results through a wide range of specification checks to ensure that the main findings endured. So we also looked at whether the results were robust across urban-rural areas. It's the urban-rural divide that is so often spoke of now. And what we found here is that the positive effect of immigrants on Native employment was slightly larger in denser, more urban geographic areas. But in both dense and less dense areas, the effect of immigration was positive and statistically significant. What this implies is that our estimate of the national effect of immigration based on trends across geographic areas was actually a slight underestimate of the true average effect on Native US residents as a whole, because stronger effects of, in higher population areas, more Americans overall are going to see these positive employment effects of immigration. Moving on to the next slide. We also were concerned that perhaps because of the time period of our study, 2005 to 2016, that the Great Recession might somehow have artificially created the results we found. For example, suppose that the recession was bad for immigrants who then left, but that the recession was also really, was even worse perhaps for Native workers. Is that what we found? We found when we did the result, we ran the regressions over the different time periods, we found that this was not the case, and that in fact, periods of growth in which both migration and Native employment were growing, that these periods were the ones that were driving our results. Next slide, please. We also wanted to check to see whether our results were robust across education. So past theory and also evidence propose that the effect of immigration will vary for different groups of Native workers. And so when we did this, we wanted to explore the effects, possible effects of education. And so we re-estimated our model using labor market outcomes for different groups of Native workers defined by their educational attainment. And what we found was that the positive effect of immigration was stronger among Natives with more education, while the effect was statistically insignificant among Natives with less education. In fact, we found that the largest positive effect of immigration was on the employment of Native workers who had some college education but had not completed a 4-year college degree. And we, perhaps it was these workers that combined particularly effectively, most effectively, with immigrants during the time period of our study. Next slide, please. So we placed these results in the context of other studies that have been done. As Ryan mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, the National Academies of Sciences reported on immigration in 2017. They found that there was great heterogeneity in empirical results, but, quote, little evidence that immigration significantly affects the overall employment levels of Native-born workers, end quote. There was some evidence that younger workers, teenagers, or previous immigrants might lose out. Madeline Zavodny, in a recent policy brief, reports results that support ours. So she used a similar data set, but a different structure, and finds statistical results that are very similar in both size and significance to ours. She also finds no evidence that immigration reduces Native employment. And finally, our closing thoughts. Thank you. Our analysis then suggests that either Native workers combined with new immigrant labor in productive ways that created more employment opportunities for Natives, such as leveraging new divisions of labor, or businesses expanded by outfitting their workers with more equipment and machinery. Or possibly that both may have occurred during this, the time period that we study. The interesting geographic heterogeneity in our results also suggests that we may learn more about pathways by looking at these geographic differences. We suspect that these differences may be associated with geographical variation in industries, immigrant enclaves, as well as specific state and local policies. But a complete view awaits future investigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan and Malmay. Those are very interesting results. So from the BPC perspective, when we got the results of the research that Ryan and Malmay had done, we noted some of the same things. You know, we sit in Washington, D.C., and the political debates about immigration tend to very much revolve around the impacts of immigrants to Americans and American workers. There's been a lot of conversations about the impact of immigrants on jobs and wages, and that's one of the reasons we really wanted to do this particular study. Another reason was the idea of localizing the impacts. Sometimes the economic research looks at national rates of employment, looks at national averages, but most people experience their economies on a local level. And so one of the important factors of this research was really trying to get down to those localized impacts of how people in various communities might experience the impact of immigrants in their communities. And you know, pleasantly surprised to find it seems that immigrants are actually helping Americans in the workplace a little bit. So Ryan and Malmay, I'll just start off with a few questions while we wait to see if we have questions from the audience. And I'll just remind folks, you can tweet your questions at BPC_bipartisan using the hashtag BPCLive, or you can email questions to bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. So Ryan and Malmay, one of the things I wanted to ask is, and you kind of got to this a little in your presentation, but maybe you can go down a little bit deeper. In the first set of graphs, you showed sort of the overall percentage of immigrants in the country, sort of the stock, but also some data that shows the change in the rates of immigration in various regions. Do you think, based on what you've seen so far, that how much of an impact is the rate of immigration to an area? For example, if they see a fairly rapid increase or a fairly large increase over a period of time, or do you think that it's about the numbers or some combination of the two? And I don't know who wants to take that, Ryan or Malmay.
Yeah, would you like to weigh in on that one, Malmay?
Go ahead, you go first.
I guess we're talking about slide 5. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so.
Should we look at slide 5?
If you want to get back to slide 5. There we go, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, slide 5 is striking because we see these very different levels and changes in immigration over time, over very recent time, really. So we're talking about George W. Bush into Obama and now into Trump. And politically speaking, I think this really kind of tells you why immigration is a hot button topic. There are big increases in places where previously there weren't many immigrants. It surprised us, though, that the results, in fact, really did not follow the geography so much. So getting back to your question, I guess it depends what you're talking about, whether we're talking about the economic impacts or we're talking about the political impacts. And I guess these days it's hard really to think about just the economic impacts. It seems like politics is kind of the story right now.
Right. But from your work, let's focus on the economic impacts.
Sure.
Sure.
You know, you have large absolute changes in the percentage of immigrants in a region that's happened over a relatively short period of time. And so one of the questions is, if you're talking about, you talked about earlier about sort of the economy adjusting to influxes of new workers. Does the time frame in which immigrants arrive and the rate of that arrival impact that outcome, do you think? Or does your research have enough information to show that?
I'll say a few quick words about it. I think it implies that the rate doesn't matter a ton for the economic effect. That was the big surprise, and if we can switch quickly to slide 11, that's where it's shown. The spots where there were big changes in immigration. So the West North Central is my favorite one. That's about middle here in the graph, was a place in which there's a very large positive effect, it appears. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you might think that this would be a very jarring change for the West North Central, but it resulted in big employment gains for natives. At the same time, places where there were large changes, I guess New England is not the best example here. Can we find one with the Middle Atlantic? I guess we ultimately don't see much relationship between this result here in this slide and the level or the rate of change. It implies that what was happening was immigrants were going where jobs were. And it didn't have a whole lot to do with the ability of the area to absorb immigrants based on the past history.
Yeah. Well, that was going to lead to one of my other questions is that you noticed that lower areas that have lower immigration seem to have a greater impact. And you mentioned some of the theories why maybe there's different industries that utilize the workforce in different ways in those geographic areas, or I wonder if you looked at whether the native population in those areas has changed. So you looked definitely at the arrival of immigrants, but whether there was an increase or decrease in the native population. We hear often that immigrants will sometimes go to areas where the native workforce the native population is declining and help essentially sustain an area. Is there any evidence of that in your work?
I would say yes, there is. Perhaps Mount May has more to say about that. I'm not sure I know more.
I'm not sure either. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I threw that one out at you.
If it helps, we could look back at Figure 4, which I think illustrates what Teresa was talking about, that there are places where we know there's out-migration of natives as well. Now, they are lumped together here, for example. So slide 4, please. One previous to this.
There we go.
Yeah, in the West-North Central, the very interesting cases here are probably South Dakota and North Dakota, because during the period you've got the fracking boom, I think more in North Dakota, not so much South Dakota. You also have, I think that's Nebraska, right, and then Kansas beneath it, where we know there's been out-migration, especially of college-educated natives. And it turns out during this period, in-migration of immigrants. So I think Teresa's quite right that in a spot like that, and again, we're mashing a bunch of different states together, such as I think Minnesota has less of a challenge with kind of the native flight, if you want to call it that, than, say, South Dakota does. But you do have evidence that immigrants are showing up to occupy industries where perhaps there was a shortage of labor. You also see North Dakota, of course, which is this interesting hybrid where there probably was in-migration of immigrants, certainly huge in-migration of native workers moving up to take advantage of the fracking boom. So it's a variety of things. I'm not sure we can pinpoint really any one particular story. I think that's really, in a way, the magical element of this research is that it suggests there are a bunch of different things happening in these different regions, all together producing an average result that is striking because it's a positive effect on native employment in most of these regions.
Yeah.
Right, and at the same time, our study is really looking at the effect of immigrant labor force share, so it's taking into account the size of the population associated with the native employment rate. So in terms of whether the total population had changed, that is something that is accounted for in part in our kind of study design.
Yeah, and I remember that's pointed out in the report. We looked not just at, or you looked not just at the ratio of immigrants to those in the workforce, which would discount those who may have gone out of the workforce, whether due to immigration or other things, but you actually looked at the total population as well, and that's factored in. I think that's relevant to point out.
I think that's right, and if I could just say another thing about that, we were very concerned that this would be a problem, that during the Great Recession, there was a big drop in native and immigrant labor force participation. And so we were concerned that what this was picking up was discouraged U.S. workers, and that's not the case, it turns out. Quite to our surprise, I think we both expected to see a different result when we looked at participation rates instead of employment rates. The problem being, as you know, that employment rates will only count those people who are either looking for work or with a job already, and they'll miss entirely the people who are not in the labor force anymore because they're discouraged.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your presentation that there's some other research that suggests that newer immigrants might displace previous immigrants. Does that suggest something about the rate at which maybe the economy can absorb new immigrants? You know, if that's the group that we are engaging, that seems to be most vulnerable, is one way to put it, to new immigration flows. Any thoughts on that from the research you have?
May, do you want to take that one?
Right. So I think there haven't been that many studies. So there was at least one study that saw that there was a negative impact of new immigration on low-skilled previous migrants, immigrants who had migrated in previous years. And so it could point to kind of a possible crowding effect, but the evidence is not yet comprehensive, I think, on that front.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the methodology. You talked about, you know, the treatment effect in medical studies. In what ways do you think your methodology was somewhat different or new from previous studies that have looked at some of these impacts?
Sure, I can take that one. We built on or stood on the shoulders of previous studies. I would say that it was very much related to the body of literature that has looked at this as best it can. And our caveat is that these are not geographic areas that immigrants have been sent to as a result of policy. And that was the magic of the Mariel Boatlift paper, where Miami was treated by this exodus of Marielitos out of Cuba. Other studies can't really do that. They can't leverage the magic of, you know, what, of course, at the time was a big humanitarian issue as well. We have seen other examples of that sort of thing. The last thing to say, though, is that a study similar to ours, this was mentioned by Madeline Zavodny, had looked at very similar data and used a different statistical technique that I don't think we'll get into the details of, that tries to apply these kinds of rigorous control and treatment group assignments to observational data such as we use. And surprisingly, I can't emphasize this enough, the size and statistical significance of her results were almost identical to ours. Mm-hmm. I was not expecting that at all, but it suggests that what we're looking at is a pretty good approximation of what you would see if you actually had control groups and treatment groups. It's broadly consistent with a lot of other modern research. The other thing that we had not mentioned in this talk, but had discussed, I think at length during the planning stages, all of us, was how there was a study done for This American Life and Ira Glass, I think, on National Public Radio about the state of Alabama that looked at this kind of thing there and used a very similar methodology. And the story, again, was that even though the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, is from Alabama, was concerned about the displacement of poultry workers, I think it was, who were native-born versus immigrant workers, if you look at treated areas of Alabama versus control areas of Alabama, it suggests that immigration was not responsible for declining employment rates in Alabama.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the David Card Mariel Boatlift study. I mean, that's been, I think, you know, for those that are engaged in the immigration and economic debate, the sort of seminal study that everybody points to, and it's been debated back and forth recently by other economists whether or not the methodology was correct or it can be replicable. But one thing I think that is different, and Ryan, you mentioned this, is that that's sort of, if you will, a shock to the system, right? You had a short period of time in which a lot of people arrived. And yes, I imagine for researchers, that's a great way of sort of looking at if there are effects. But our economy doesn't usually work that way, right? Immigrants come over a period of time. We have very few of those, what I would call shock impacts. And so if we're trying to decide what the impacts of immigration are on American workers, it should be closer to the way our economy actually absorbs them and deals with them and responds to them, and American workers respond to them over time. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, sort of that, what's different about that sort of particular model to what we're looking at here?
Ryan,
sure, I'll weigh in and then May can start as well.
Sure.
the policy lever one might think of is probably something that's not a short shock like the Marielitos were, and that's absolutely right that our economy works by adjusting, and we probably ought to be thinking about policies that are changing the gradual flow of immigrants in. So our study is probably a little bit more relevant, really, in terms of the timing of it. In terms of the clean identification, the Mariel Boatlift paper is probably better. Does Mame, do you want to weigh in on this too?
Right, I think that's probably one of I mean, it's the strength and the weakness, right? The strength of our paper is that it has this broader perspective. No, over 12 years during a time where there was different folks who were in political power, there's a lot of things going on, very different periods in terms of the economics of what was happening in the United States. And we're able to look at this nationally representative data, annual data across the whole of the United States, and to see like what the apparent influence of immigration is on Native employment. So I think you're right, Teresa, in terms of our study gives us a very broad and perhaps perspective on that relationship that other more specific studies can't.
So thinking about what you've learned from this, if you were to design sort of your next follow-on study, what areas of research does this suggest we should look into next, and where would you like to see this go?
Yeah, I think we'd be really interested to look deeper into this geographic kind of heterogeneity, what's happening in these different different districts, in these different geographical areas, and some of the pathways that I mentioned in the presentation that we'd really like to look into would be how the types of industries have changed or over time, or just the characteristics of industries in the different geographies are immigrant enclaves, the strengths of kind of already existing immigrant populations, and second generation, third generation populations that exist in these different areas, as well as the possible influence of specific state and local policies.
Yeah. So I mean, between the two of you, we have sort of a demographer, sociologist, and an economist, right? It seems like those areas of studies cross over a bunch of things, right? So, if you're looking at immigrant enclaves and areas where immigrants have settled and how that impacts the success of immigrants in the economy or how those immigrants interact with natives, that's an interesting merger of two fields right there. I think that would be absolutely fascinating to continue to work on. Let me ask you a kind of other interesting question, maybe a backwards question if you want. So one of the issues that we have seen, and you sort of mentioned it, is that people sort of take away from immigrant research and immigration research, particularly immigration research, economic immigration research. Sometimes they take away the wrong conclusions. If you had to say sort of if somebody reading this paper, what might be some way that would be a wrong conclusion from this paper? So we've said that we believe from this research that arrival of immigrants into an area can help Native employment, that it doesn't result in a decline of Native Americans who are employed. And we've seen from this research that tends to happen across the country in areas with a lot of immigrants and areas with few immigrants. But what would be a wrong way to read this? Can you try to think about that?
If I could, I have a thought.
Sure.
I don't think we emphasized a lot in the paper, but the paper is about the effect of immigrants on Native U.S. workers' employment, and that's a very reasonable thing to focus on. I think the mistake that gets made is to take away from this that things are great for Native U.S. workers, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the effect of immigrants on U.S. workers' employment. It's like a treatment effect. Mm-hmm. What we saw in Alabama in this segment on This American Life that was done by some other economists was that, in fact, Alabama workers were suffering, but they were suffering universally. They weren't suffering in high immigrant regions. So that can still be true, and it is true, at the same time that the other message is also true, that immigrants do not seem to reduce employment opportunities of natives. We spoke to this a little bit also in our presentation when we discussed the impact or lack of an impact of the Great Recession, or whether the Great Recession was driving the results. It can still be the case that the Great Recession hit and made everybody worse off. that's still true. And it's also true that it appears to be the case immigrants raise the employment opportunities of natives in local areas because the economy is good. So I think that's the problem, that it's easy to mistake a positive treatment effect with good times. And we're not saying that. We're saying that there's no evidence that immigration is a negative treatment.
Mao-Mei, did you want to add anything?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I think that's important to note, Ryan. I think, I like to say very often that I don't think immigration is the cause or the cure for any of our ills in this country, and we keep trying to make it so. And I think from our perspective, one of the important outcomes of this research is that if you're trying to ascribe sort of declines in American employment, immigration is not to appear to be the cause of that there are other factors that are involved that we should be looking to, but immigration and focusing heavily or overly on immigration as one of the causality factors doesn't seem to be the right place to put our attention. So I think that's about all I have. We have not had a lot of questions, but that's okay from the audience. I think we've had a very good discussion. Are there any last thoughts, Ryan or Mao-Mei, that you want to sort of wrap up our conversation here?
I think that was an excellent way of summarizing what you just said, Teresa. So I have nothing additional.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Well, okay, I want to thank you both. We approached you with this research. We had this idea. I'll be honest, it started with a BPC intern, Jose Perales, who came up with this idea to do this sort of look. He started the research. So for those of you looking to do research in DC, see your research can have impact. So as an intern, your research can be taken up by renowned PhD economists and turned into something productive there. So to keep that in mind when you're looking for your next internships. But I want to thank you both for being great partners, for working with us on this research. We hope we can do more on this. As you mentioned, this opens up a lot of other avenues of questions. I'll just remind our audience, if you want to find the report again, you can go to www.bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Please look up Ryan and Mao-Mei at the University of Berkeley. If you're really into the details, the working paper that has all of the minutia of the methodology and the regressions and all of that stuff that I don't understand is available. Ryan, do you have the website for the working paper at Berkeley?
Gosh.
On our webpage, so that those of you who want to go even deeper can dive very much deeper into this. I want to thank you both. I want to thank those of us in our audience for joining us today. If you have questions afterwards, please feel free to email us at bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. We'll be happy to try to follow up with you if you're viewing this at a later time than our live webcast. This video will be posted up on our website so people can look at it later. And thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.